as we said, like we're here, TASO and those of us in the room, because we care about the evidence on tackling inequality. And we've got two more people on this panel, in conversation with, to talk a bit further, both about their personal experiences, but what that reveals in terms of wider social inequalities and challenges in terms of equality in higher education. So we have Ibz Mo, who is a educational influencer. He's got, I do recommend strongly, I've looked at them myself, a lot of his videos on YouTube, as well as following him on Twitter and social media generally. And Lindsay Hanley, a author and journalist who's done a lot of work on class inequality in Britain. And Lindsay will be interviewing Ibz Mo. So with no further ado, thank you both.
Hi. Thank you for coming back after lunch, everybody. Before we get going, there is a Slido poll that we can fill in now. Do you think equality gaps in higher education have been reduced in the last 20 years? That's a very broad brush statement, but if you'd like to contribute, the poll should come up shortly. Who's the definitely? Okay, well, okay, it's narrowing. A fairly, well, extremely decisive refutation of the idea that equalities have been reduced, definitely, or in a way that suggests you might be able to stop thinking about it now. But yeah, there's almost equal parts, not enough, and to some extent. And I suppose that probably reflects the fact that equality represents many, many different facets, and it's quite clear that some aspects of inequality may have been closed and decisively not others. Okay then. So me and Ibz are here to talk today about some of our own experiences of, I think, going into higher education from very much non-traditional backgrounds at very, very different times. I went to university in 1994, and I'm probably old enough to be Ibz's mum. Why did I say that? And graduated probably around the time that you were born, actually. At a time when it felt like there were very, very few kids from council estates going to university, in particular Russell Group type universities. I very, very quickly got to university and felt extremely odd right from the outset, and had a sort of a culture shock that I've never really quite got over, really. Ibz went to Cambridge University, having grown up in Hackney, and you had sort of middling, would you say, GCSE results?
Really poor.
Right.
Really bad. Yeah, really rubbish. But thank you for middling. But no, no, really bad.
But then you absolutely smashed it out the park at A level, and were offered a place at Wolfson College in Walton College, Cambridge, and I followed it up with a master's at Oxford. Now that's pretty big style, isn't it?
It's definitely something that I am very lucky and blessed. I think, yeah, when I do look back now at my educational upbringing, as you said, kids on council estates, on free school meals, so Oxford and Cambridge, it definitely is a big jump. But equally, I think that, I don't know, sometimes I'm like, would I do it again? Would I recommend it? I think for me, I definitely focus on being the first person to do it so that, for example, my kids don't have to do it. So as much as I liked it and I would recommend it to an extent, I think I did it because I knew that it was a really big beacon and a really big representation of like success in our kind of modern society.
Yeah. So I mean, that speaks to a kind of, you've got quite a level-headed attitude then to the sort of to the kind of pros and cons of, is it going to university at all or an elite university from a working class background, would you say?
Yeah, for me it would be elite university.
Right.
Because there are times, because majority of my circle, so growing up in Hackney, the majority of my circle either didn't go to university or went to universities that, for example, weren't Russell groups or like kind of weren't in the top 50 or league tables. And I would love to visit them, I would love to go see their friends, but then being in Oxford and Cambridge in that bubble, and then even having that network of friends that are, again, in the kind of top 5, top 10s, it's, yeah, as you said, sometimes it's a really big culture shock.
Yeah. And do you feel like it's something still resonating with you now?
I'm definitely going through therapy. Like, no, it definitely is something that does impact me. Yeah, definitely to this day. I think it always will. I think even when I do think about like kids and my future family, and just that bubble of Oxbridge, I graduated my master's like in the November just gone, and kind of seeing just a trajectory of my Oxbridge friends and their careers and the money making and the background, and I think just how different it is for them to me. I think it definitely will always have an impact. And plus we're alumni of our universities, all right, for every single university. So I think it's always going to be a lifelong decision and a lifelong impact.
Yeah. I've seen you described Cambridge not only as a bubble, but as a snow globe, in the sense that it was an extremely white as well as an extremely middle
Who gave her that quote? That was prime.
You said it,
Yeah,
you said it. And it's a really, really good description. As well as an extremely middle class environment. So do you think there's a particular way that race and class intersect, at the higher echelons of HE?
Definitely. Absolutely. I think, universities were founded by white men for white men, with white men, and I think that was definitely Oxford and Cambridge to its core. I think you still see it resonate now with college leaders. Colleges at Oxbridge, women don't represent a really big representation anymore. So I think it definitely intersects. I think it always will intersect. But I do think that in terms of the student experience, going there, I think as a person of colour and as someone who comes from a low-income background, that low-income factor is definitely a really big thing. And a lot of my friends there who, I'm close to a lot of people at Oxbridge, but when it comes to friends who, look like me, come from a similar culture, but have a completely different way of life when it comes to finances and capital and like family capital as well and future capital, it's just absolutely different. So yeah, it does intersect, but I do think that there are times where I do crave more class-focused interventions than I do race interventions. Not to say that we don't need them, but I think that we do need a lot more class interventions.
Yeah. I mean, what was your impression attending your interview, for instance?
Yeah, so the whole thing was really intimidating. I went to, the first time I went to Cambridge was to do the interview because I didn't have money to go to an open day. Also, open days, like you have to register, and I didn't know that you had to register to go to an open day, so I didn't go. The interview was very intimidating, but I think what got me through was my academic passion, and I think what got me to Oxford and Cambridge was the fact that I'm really interested in my subjects. I did politics and psychology in Cambridge, and then I did higher education at Oxford. And it's always been my passion, my attitude, that has been able to kind of put me through. So yes, it was intimidating, but my love for my subject, I think, really pushed me through.
Yeah. But I mean, you touch on a really significant thing there, don't you? Which is that you didn't know that such a thing as University Open Days existed. And it's the case that you sort of basically were living independently and financially supporting yourself whilst doing your A-levels. Were your sixth form college, because you went to a sixth form college in East London, were they aware of your circumstances and helped to mitigate the impact of them so that you could apply to Cambridge?
Yes and no. So I went to B6 Sixth Form College, and I'm a very proud B6 alumni. I think that they were aware of it because our sixth form was 90%, around 90% were on free school meals. Right. This is not including those who kind of recorded it as well, or those who were just maybe above the threshold. So they were definitely aware that we came from really bad circumstances. It was just very unlikely for students to get into a roster group, yet alone kind of elite university. So I guess I wasn't given that attention. So I did do a lot of research on social media. Didn't really find a lot, hence why I did work on social media. But I will say, and you know, I have a teacher, Jill Bucock, who I quote like every day. I'm sure at my wedding she'll be quoted as like in my wedding vows. She literally was the teacher who just, you know, the first one who said to me, it was like, you can get an A in this subject. And that was the first time someone said you could do anything, get along, get an A. And so I just fell in love with just school, and I think I just have a need to please my teachers. And so I did really well, and then she mentored me a lot. So yeah, my sociology teacher. And that's usually the case for a lot of students who come from low-income backgrounds, who went to you know, non-selective comprehensive state schools. When they arrive at the university, they usually do say it was one teacher who inspired my journey.
Yeah. And it really can just take one person to inspire you.
Did you have one
to
teacher?
believe it? Yes. Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Was it Jill Bucock?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. Unless she was training on the outskirts of Birmingham in the late 80s, I don't know. You know. No. It was actually no. It was a couple. It was a couple. I had an English teacher, Jude Humphreys, and a humanities teacher, Ken Bird, who they were just extraordinary people, and sort of just, it sounds really cheesy, but they were just sort of like a light in this endless fog of kind of how do any of us get out of these circumstances? You know, like we've been put here at school, we're supposed to get something out of it, and it just wasn't happening. But it was their existence and their focus and their inspiration that actually made me feel like, yes, I could.
Yeah.
I could do it. I mean, that is very, very much in stark contrast to the interview I had at Cambridge. You got in, I didn't you? Whereas the guy who interviewed me at Cambridge basically took one look at me. The minute I opened my mouth, he basically burst out laughing, and that was the end of it. So I hope you had a better experience at your Cambridge interview.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, this is a therapy session. No, yeah, definitely. I think, so I definitely felt intimidated, but I just remembered to kind of constantly be myself. And I think at the time, so I interviewed in 2016, so I think it was very different to the way they approach. I don't want to just talk about Oxbridge, but one thing, last thing I will say is, you know, it is a collegiate-based system, and so there are colleges that are different. And my college, Wolfson College, again, I'm very proud to say I've gone there because they really their approach to diversity was really good, and so they were aware that people came from different backgrounds, as opposed to different colleges that you may have applied to. And I think that is the problem that you see in those elite kind of universities, is the way they avoid transparency is by saying Oxbridge, Oxford and Cambridge. Journalism has a massive factor into this because nobody likes to specify St. John's College or Wolfson College because nobody knows what on earth Wolfson College is. They like to clickbait on Oxbridge. But I think they were a college that just had a really good staff, really good internal policy, and instead of kind of wanting a kind of diversity tick, they wanted to celebrate my diversity, if that made sense. Yeah. And they would ask you questions like, what do you do for equality and diversity, as opposed to, okay, you're brown, you're poor, tick, tick. Yeah. So, I think it's a different approach.
So you were actively treated, from the outset, do you feel you were actively treated as someone who could make a contribution that was not only welcome but necessary?
To an extent, because while they did celebrate kind of, you know, my background, when it comes to social media, elite universities are not familiar with social media. At least when I started in 2017, they were scared of it. They were absolutely scared of the fact that I was making videos online because they couldn't control it. And also, I always just remember saying to myself, I am paying £9,250 a year to be here, plus I'm taking out a loan, so I do have a right to comment on the university and also hold them accountable. So I think they did support me. Social media, it was a journey for them to appreciate that.
Yeah. Were they not used to it being held accountable in such a direct way, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. And I think also I just had a really strong personality. And I think I was really honest and authentic about kind of my critiqueness on whiteness of the university. And, you know, you had a few staff members that were quite concerned about it, but then equally I was celebrated a lot because once you start getting students in and at an interview you're like, why did you apply? And they say, oh, because I watched a YouTuber called Ibz Mo on social media. Then of course, once they start to see the benefit, then they're my best friend and they want to work with me. But before that, I can see why they were scared, absolutely. But I definitely think that has completely changed now, and I think that universities and higher ed practitioners are absolutely adopting social media on all aspects.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about YouTube, isn't it? And about social media, I guess, really, which is that realising that growing up, you know, my kind of role models were basically pop stars, and they tended not to have gone to university and were extremely distant-seeming figures. And what you seem to have done is basically used YouTube as a kind of form of direct democracy, really.
Oh, wow. I'm going to put that on my CV. Direct democracy, I love that.
Well, I mean, you know, I've got mixed feelings about direct democracy, but in your example, you saw a medium such as YouTube and thought, well, I'm from a working class background. I've grown up using these kind of media. In this sense, they are genuinely open access. There is no gatekeeping. You know, there's no guy. You know, there's no White Oxbridge guy. At least one that you can physically see saying, no, you cannot use YouTube. You had a phone. How did you use YouTube, by the way? Was it at the school, on the school computers, or?
No, I had a laptop.
Oh, you did have a laptop? Yeah,
no, with YouTube, in terms of how I started, I filmed it all in my room. But it was very authentic. I didn't think about it leading to a large scale. I just really wanted to give like honest and personal advice. If you're struggling in school and you can't afford X, Y, and Z, here's a broke person example. And then when it came to like talking about people of colour, again, I would get my friends at Oxbridge, the very few there were at the time, but everyone was kind of really glad and open and honest. And I think there's a really cool debate now between how universities are portraying the student experience online. So for example, through the use of social media, mine was independent. I wasn't paid for the university, and I didn't do it on the university channel. I did it on my own platform. As opposed to now, where we're seeing a lot of higher ed practitioners who are going on social media, who are using the student experience on that platform, which I think there's a political bias, because then you're assuming that the student experience is good, and you're also using it as a marketing strategy versus as an honest experience, where you're allowing students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds to make an objective opinion. Do I want to go here? Do I want to invest X amount of money? Do I want to get into X amount of debt and be an alumni for the rest of my life based on a marketing strategy? So I think we need to be very careful with how we use social media, but my advice is always for it to be honest and open.
Yeah. I mean, what was the point where you started making videos? Where was the point at which you started getting a sort of a decent amount of interaction with people who were watching them, and sort of starting to realise that there were so many people out there like you who fundamentally lacked information, who really wanted to achieve but fundamentally lacked information?
I think it happened overnight, to be honest with you, because I did a video about how to just do well in A-levels as someone who comes from a poor background. And it kind of just picked up on the algorithm for whatever reason really quickly. And so here's the thing, you know, the university communications department were like my biggest supporters. They were my mentors. Nick and Lloyd, who were like the kind of head of comms, they're going to be the best men at my wedding. There's a lot happening at my wedding involving education staff.
Can I come too? Yeah.
I'll send you an invite. And basically, so they really platformed me and they kind of celebrated it. I think for me, there was a moment where I realized, okay, wow, I'm actually doing something good here, was there was a summer school happening at the time, and I had direct messages from the applicants or from the students who were residents at the time, and just telling me like I'm having a really bad time at the summer school. Like it is really white here. My biggest fears have been confirmed. And they were just like, can we organize a meetup? And so the access officer then reached out to me and we had a meetup. And I think for them to say, you know, like, I'm literally applying here because of you, and I think that was a really big aspect. And that's been happening a lot now, you know, not just me. There's a lot of other education influencers out there who are doing amazing work at other universities. I just think for me, the biggest impact was I just really was the complete opposite of what you expect from like a Cambridge student. I was very sassy. I am very flamboyant. I used to wear wigs like on my channel. I was like, just to break the ice. And I'm a big fan of using comedy as well. So I think that just kind of broke any barrier that students had. And I think that's what appealed them to me.
Yeah. I mean, do you feel as though your use of social media has helped to not just sort of demystify the university for people who are sort of coming around to the idea of university sort of almost like just before the point at which they might go, but also as well as demystifying it, are you know, was your intention always to make it seem possible in the way that it became a possibility for you when at one time it might never have seemed a possibility?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question.
Sorry.
Okay, so I would say I definitely had a saviorism complex, which I kind of sometimes dislike that I did, where I went there and I automatically thought the time for Oxbridge or for universities to become more educated and to kind of meet the needs for diverse students was to get more students coming in. And so it really was just an outreach plan in the beginning. It was then in my second year when I started to actually do student politics and become VP of the college council that I realized that change also has to happen within and also top down. So it was, I did use it as a tool to kind of want to inspire people to get people in. But recently, as I've become more experienced working with the kind of those universities, I realized that it really has to come from the top and it really has to come like within the college, because the downfall is you're doing the outreach, but then you're not having any inreach, nor upreach. You're getting the students here, but then are you actually looking after them?
Yeah.
I think sometimes we forget that, like, why is a student disadvantaged because they come from a low, like, privileged background? Like, why? Is it because they can't afford this? Is it because they don't have the knowledge or the access to certain techniques, or they don't have a certain understanding of how to write an essay or how to be an academic? Then what is the university doing to accommodate that? And I think that's the discussion that universities are happening now. We're so focused on meeting the quotas and making our websites look really diverse, but now that we're here, like, what are you doing?
Yeah. I think you did, once you arrived at Cambridge, you did have some, or, you know, quite a lot of difficulties that you then documented on your YouTube videos. Was there a point at which you thought this whole sort of combination of difficulties that are making it, you know, objectively more difficult for me to be a student here than for most of the other students here? Was there ever a point where you thought, I'm on the verge of dropping out, or I'm going to drop out?
No, I don't think I ever had that, because I knew how much of a big deal it was. Probably it was a big deal for the wrong reasons, but I knew how much of a big deal it was to be there. And again, while I, for example, may have faced issues on a college community level, I loved my education. Like, and I think sometimes we forget, well, I forgot why I was at uni, but when it came to the learning aspect, I literally loved being able to, I love the syllabus, I love the lecturers, I love the supervisions. I really was just there for the academics, so I had to kind of remind myself that. So I didn't feel like I wanted to drop out.
Yeah. And were you able to sustain yourself financially while you were there?
That's a really good question. Yes and no. So I think, so in terms of finances, I kind of come from a very low income background. So I met all the needs to get like the highest loan. And this is something that I touched on in my dissertation. So my dissertation at Oxford was to look at the free school meal student experiences of Oxbridge undergraduates at the time. And one big aspect that I found, I did a bunch of, we did some interviews, we did a student barometer survey, we controlled for free school meals, and we found that a lot of students on free school meals didn't know actually how to manage money because they haven't been given any information, or they've never had grands in their account before. A lot of students who have worked part-time jobs, maybe that's, you know, to some extent money, but in terms of actually having a lump sum of student finance and making that stretch till the end of term, that's a lesson that you need to have kind of almost literally finance on, and our parents are obviously not in position to teach us that. I don't remember being told once or been given any guidance from a university or even my sixth form on how to manage that. And so I think financially, just because I had a lack of awareness of finances, that's what made me struggle.
Yeah. So was it the case that you were given not enough to last, was it a whole semester's worth of loan that you were given at a time?
Yeah, and I think that's the usual thing for a lot of universities. You're given a kind of semester first. But it wasn't the amount, if I'm honest with you. It wasn't the fact that we weren't given enough. I think that you could definitely make it last, and I think that I think there are definitely bursaries that I had access to. It was just more about kind of, you grow up poor, you grow up eating. I mean, I grew up very poor, so I also used to cook for myself. So you grew up eating really basic food and trying to make certain amount of money stretch. At the moment you get a lump sum of money, what am I going to spend it on? Am I going to just? And it sounds really weird, but there is this kind of dopamine level association with ordering food when you come from a poor background, and being able to okay, I have the money now to celebrate my life. Wanting to go out on nights out where before you didn't have the money to even go for a takeaway. So I think it's just about kind of the psychological aspect of being tied to financial security that I think a lot of young people are struggling with today.
Yeah. Well, a lot of that is to do with the fact that it's all borrowed as well, isn't it? It's kind of, did you have a sense of kind of, oh my gosh, most of this is loans? Am I at university in order to get a job that will then mean I can spend 20 years paying back that loan? Or does it all just become numbers in the end?
I think it just became numbers. I didn't think that I would have to pay this back. I'm only realising that now, that student finances, just seeing it on my paycheck, realising that maybe I should have, not taken as much of a loan. No, I think in that moment, again, I don't think students at that time are thinking about the long term of loans. Maybe their parents are, but I don't think students at that time are. I think we're very kind of carpe diem, live in the moment. I'm sure some of you can relate, to having money coming from your student finance and then spending it all on one night, maybe. Anyone else? Not just me?
No, but I mean, in what other situation are you going to get? Are you going to suddenly see a 4-figure sum turn up in your bank account in no other situation? I mean, I'm particularly interested in this, and, from a kind of, kind of shame perspective, really, in the sense that I went when it was free. I received maintenance, grants. My loans are absolutely minimal. I paid them off within a year of graduating on a not that great salary, and I fret and get angry constantly about this burden of debt that people from disadvantaged backgrounds are being exposed to at a point where it's by no means guaranteed that those debts will be paid, and just the sheer stress toll of what that's like psychologically. Do you think there's a sort of for younger people who are sort of basically kind of, you have to get a degree, you have to get a degree, and we, the kind of cognitive dissonance. Do you feel as though maybe not so much the HE sector, but government in general kind of goes out of its way to pretend that graduating with £60,000 worth of debt basically doesn't matter?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Clearly it does.
Absolutely. I think that a lot, in terms of, our working class students being disadvantaged from higher education, how do they feel about applying? I think that there's been some improvements, and I think that certain higher ed institutions are to some extent accessible for working class students, but then is the workforce kind of suitable for working class graduates? Because I don't think that it is. And sometimes I do look at this country and I kind of just do think, would I pay X amount of money to go into university, to go into debt? I think for me, my justification was I went to an international university. That's what justified it for me a lot of the times. My master's was, I had scholarships, so I didn't really feel that burden, and if anything, it motivated me to do a master's because I knew that there was a scholarship body there. So I think, it's more about kind of, now that you have a graduate who's in debt, are they going to kind of be served well in the workforce? And I don't think they are. No, exactly. I mean, that's a kind of form of aftercare as much as anything else, isn't it? I mean, do you feel that as though
did going to university per se, in particular going to an Oxford University, did it politicise you in a way where you weren't politicised before? Because I know you studied sociology and had an absolute passion for sociology. Did studying sociology at A level sort of alert you sort of to the structural nature of the inequalities that you were facing, that you then sort of manifest once you got to university?
Yeah, definitely. Sociology at A-level gets so much criticism from the government, and it's so ridiculous, and psychology and media, which are all A-levels that I did, which is not the best. But it definitely prepared me. I think it just kind of made me more aware of, from an objective point of view, the inequalities we do have. But then I also think just experience going there and realizing, wow, there are so many privileged kids here. And, you know, even inequalities within Oxbridge and how there's a hierarchy within a hierarchy. I definitely think it made me more aware, but sociology definitely did help that. I always recommend sociology to a lot of students. I tutor sociology at A-level quite a lot. Yeah. And usually the students I have are usually, again, people of color from working class backgrounds. And I've tutored like for 5 years sociology at A-level. I've had a lot of students. I've not heard one of them kind of critique the subject as it being something that kind of hinders their ability to see the world. If anything, it's the opposite. It opens up.
Yeah. No, I mean it's revelatory, isn't it? And I mean the same. So you do media studies A-level as well. Yeah. This is it. The absolute opposite of a Mickey Mouse subject, isn't it? You know, just I did media studies at A-level. And you know, it was revelatory in the same way that sociology was, in terms of opening. So not even opening my eyes, but actually sort of like giving a structure and a voice to things that I was already kind of tacitly aware of anyway. You know, the inherent inequalities and the inherent injustices in society, and how these are amplified. How certain things are amplified and how certain things are deliberately quietened down in order to maintain the status quo. So sorry, your amazing teacher. Sorry, I've forgotten her name.
Jill Bucock.
Yeah, was she sociology or media studies?
Sociology, of course.
Oh, right. And who's your favourite sociologist? This is
Heidi Mirza.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Heidi Mirza talks about. So I read this study. And it's Black girls in London, and it's the idea that students are given a label based on various backgrounds, and they internalised that label, performed really bad. Then eventually, before they went to university, they rejected the label, and kind of just was able to kind of overcome teacher expectations and teacher labelling. Because while again, I admit I had amazing teachers in terms of Jill Bucock, I've also had really awful teachers, homophobic teachers, racist teachers, that definitely impacted kind of the way I view education now. I was very lucky to have Jill.
Yeah. And did you always have the sense that, you know, in the same way that a really, really excellent, you never forget a really, really excellent teacher, the effects of poor teaching and poor quality and prejudiced teachers are absolutely amplified and made quite critical for people who are struggling to access a decent education.
Yeah, especially when it comes to the application of university. Things like predicted grades, when it comes to, for example, writing student references, and even a lot of teachers, I think a lot of their words can have an impact on what university a student chooses to go to. And this isn't just applicable to Oxbridge, but again, those Rush Group universities, having a teacher say to you, I don't think you should apply there, even though this teacher didn't go there, isn't really familiar with the kind of outreach officer there, having someone say that to you, and you come from a background where your parents can't counter that because they don't have the information, or you don't have a network that can counter that, that can definitely, I think, impacts your complete trajectory. So I'm very critical of teachers who do that. Very.
I mean, obviously everybody here today is very invested in widening participation in HE and in narrowing, you know, various and multifaceted and intersecting gaps in participation in HE. Do you have a kind of single sentence message for people working in this field to say, this is what you should focus on, and this is what I, as a person who has experienced a really, really long range educational trajectory, what's the one thing?
So I have a paragraph. I don't have a sentence.
Okay, that's all right.
This is my paragraph, and this is also as that, but also as someone who has researched with like a lot of vulnerable students. So yes, it's also my words, but a lot of it comes from the kind of communities that I have kind of grown up with, and also the current generation of students. So there's 5 things. This is copyrighted. If anyone steal this, and that's on any presentation. Okay, so I call it the 5 A's. First A is acknowledgement. A lot of students from low-income backgrounds, specifically from free school meals, feel like they're just not acknowledged and they don't feel visibly seen. So in the sense of the word state school, I don't know how much you guys love the word state school or you love the word BAME. I hate these words, and I think they should be cancelled. Okay, so state school for me is just a tool that groups a lot of non-private schools together, and it doesn't show any accountability for students, for example, who went to schools that were comprehensive or non-selective. And there's a big difference into a state school that's a grammar school versus a independent sixth form or a sixth form that is state that we went to, right? It's very different. So when you have students go to these universities and they're like, okay, Cambridge or UEL or whatever university has X amount of state school students, well, when you look at the data specifically, what does it say about free school meals? And so my dissertation, where Oxbridge is saying that we have 60-70% free state schools, when I controlled for free school meals and I looked on their access plan, it's 3 to 5%. That for me is an absolute joke. That, like, sorry to sound very dramatic, but that's for me is a joke. So it's about kind of holding those words and giving power to it, saying free school meal representation needs to increase. Also the word BAME, as a person of color, I hate the word BAME. It groups, again, black and minority ethnic all into one experiences. We know that that needs to expand. And I think, so when you look at, for example, statistics on BAME, again, Oxford will tell you that, you know, we're doing really well. We're at 25%. That's above the kind of national average. When you control that, specifically, like one example is Asian group, right? So in Asian, you have Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian, and you have more. But when it comes to kind of the Asian category, they group Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi together, which doesn't make sense because then when you control for Pakistan and Bangladesh, which the LSE, they actually did a study on this, you will see that there's a massive disparity. So it's about, again, giving power to certain ethnic groups by just acknowledging that we aren't doing so well in these factors, but we are doing well in these factors, and being a bit more specific. So that's acknowledgement, and then the second A is accountability, because the whole reason to kind of give power to those words is to hold your university accountable or your HE sector. And I get why, you know, I've worked with colleges and I've worked with other universities who don't want to say that we have X amount of black students or specifically X amount of African students because it's so low. And that's going to kind of be embarrassing, and then you might have a Daily Mail article written about them. But then how are you supposed to be held accountable from the public's perception? Like, how are you supposed to be held accountable? So again, it's about kind of just being honest and releasing data. The third A is access. So I kind of highlighted this already. You know, you're doing outreach and you're bringing them in, but what about inreach and upreach? Now, the foundation year is something that Cambridge have been glorified a lot recently. And I've spoken to a lot of students who are currently at these universities and are at the colleges where the foundation year is happening. And the current theme that I'm hearing is, as undergraduates, we don't even feel comfortable being here. The university has not really fully met our needs. And now you're bringing foundation year students who are arguably more vulnerable. So there's a big debate in actually getting the students here and then focusing on them. And this is why I usually recommend that you do an opt-out support system as opposed to an opt-in. So if you know that you are having a disadvantaged student coming to your university, if you have a team that is able to sit with them and say, okay, we know that you're from a specific background, here are the facilities and here are the instruments that we have that can help you, do you want to opt out? Because I think it's easier for a student to, again, opt out than it is to opt in. So I think that's one really big aspect. And then the fourth A is accommodation. So again, this was something that was found in my dissertation, but this focused more on kind of COVID, years. I don't really know how relevant that is now, but in terms of the fees and the cost, and also, you know, a lot of working class students, I think sometimes we forget that, and I guess this also transgresses working class, but students can come from dysfunctional families. And I guess as HE practitioners, you can't really measure that, and it might not be your place to comment on a family background, but we can testify family background matters a lot. And so where your university has become your safe space and you're at your accommodation, but you have to leave during the holidays. or you're not given enough money to afford the whole entire rent for the whole academic year, and then you have to go back home where maybe you can't study because you don't have a desk, because you have dysfunctional parents, maybe because you just don't feel comfortable in your background, in your kind of area that you grew up in. So accommodation was a big factor. And the last A was advice, coming from a mentor or a more professional mentor, and not necessarily a student buddy that I think sometimes is recommended, which I think can sometimes get too political. Having a network where you can say, okay, we have alumni who also came from your background, and they're in this field working in this sector. Do you want to be in contact with them? And this comes down to kind of the development office and the alumni network officers really getting involved. But if there's one thing I've learned from being an alumni and working with other alumni, they want to help. They actually do want to help.
Yeah.
Sometimes they just lack the medium, or I guess now the kind of online interface to providing help. LinkedIn has been amazing to do that, but I also think that universities and HE practitioners could also help in creating that amazing network to offer advice. So that's my 5 A's. It's acknowledgement, accountability, access, accommodation, and advice.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I can tell you put a lot of work into the A's.
Yeah. Copyrighted.
Even more A's than you got at A-levels, that is, isn't it, actually?
Thanks for reminding me.
So I think we may have... 1 minute. 1 minute. Does anybody have the world's shortest question they'd like to ask Ibz? Yeah. Hi. Yes. Oh, there's a microphone just come in. I think, yeah.
My bad, I'll try to speak normally into this. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed listening to both of you. I just wanted to follow on from your last point. You mentioned the 5 A's. And one of the A's that we hear a lot of in outreach work and across the sector is aspiration. And talking about raising aspiration. And I noticed that, well, you didn't really speak too much about aspiration, apart from Lindsay, you talked about your aspiration to be a pop star at one point. And Ibz, I didn't really hear anything about aspiration from you, except for when I look on Twitter and you want to be an aspirational Pokemon trainer.
I'm going to turn off my social media accounts after this.
So I just wondered if you had any thoughts about our focus on raising aspirations there.
Yeah, I think raising aspirations is a really, really interesting topic. I did a paper on this actually because I know that, I think it was in 2012, the government did a really big campaign for raising aspirations, and it was criticized quite a lot because it was saying, okay, you as students, you're the problem. Like you as poor people, you're the problem. You're not just aiming high enough. And that got a lot of criticism. And I do think to some extent it is still valid because there aren't enough people and there aren't enough young students today who actually want to aspire to do certain roles because they don't know that those roles are available to them. And I think a lot of that, the way to combat that is literally education. And this is why a lot of the outreach works that are happening now focus on also empowering parents. Because I think it's the family who can also have a big aspect on your aspiration. And if you educate parents in saying, well, this is what the education kind of sector is now, they kind of might need these grades to do this subject, and therefore they can do this, then great. But I think a lot of immigrant cultures that we have, especially when it comes to looking at kind of immigrant trauma, there's 3 main jobs that a lot of parents want their kids to have, and that's a doctor, lawyer, or engineer. And there's so much criticism against that because a lot of parents don't kind of see wider scale. And you're going to university to do what? Like you're getting so much to do what? It has to be either a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. So I think it's about, of course, challenging, not challenging, I would say just kind of informing and educating parents that have a really big role. And yes, I guess raising aspirations. For me, again, it was Pokemon Trainer or the Pink Power Ranger. That was also my second option. And I think my aspiration was to become a teacher. Though when I got to Cambridge, it was then to become a lawyer. And now it's just to be retired because I'm tired. But yeah, what did you think about raising aspirations?
Well, it's a sticky one, I think, because I graduated into the new Labour periods, and the obsession was raising aspirations, and I just immediately thought, well, I always had aspirations, but there was very, very, very little available to actually cling on to that made having any kind of aspirations seem possible or achievable. I think for working class kids to be told that they don't have enough or enough of a wide range of or enough of a wide range or an acceptable range of aspirations is it just kind of speaks to the inherent snobbery in British culture, because you were saying that the sort of the three jobs, the three sort of careers that parents might want their children to go into, is being a doctor or an engineer. It's not necessarily because of social status, is it? It's because they're solid, secure, and they mean you won't be poor.
Yeah.
That's the thing, isn't it? So it's not kind of, we want you to be a doctor or a lawyer because of the standing it will give you, or because of the respect you will then be possibly afforded. It's about the security that you didn't have in the first place, isn't it? And without a basis of security, it's very, very, very hard to have the kind of aspirations that all the way through the New Labour period. When I was first coming out of university, that we were told we had to have. So I suppose that's my take on it.
I think having a good network also combats that. I think that's probably the best thing I got from university. That's probably what I got into £50,000 debt for, was for the network. Because being able to have, for example, a wide range of individuals who do so many different jobs kind of on my phone. And then, for example, I guess with the students I work with, if they're interested in, I had one student who was interested in microbiology. I have no idea what that is. But then being able to say, okay, I know someone who did biology in their masters, I'll put you in contact, and then they can kind of inform you, educate you, and help you raise your aspirations. I think network and a lack of education is really important.
Yeah, exactly. But don't blame individual working class children or communities for lacking aspirations in the first place, because those aspirations are those desires are inherent in everybody. So I think we've...
That was a good mic drop.
I am sorry to cut you
Thank
guys
you.
short, because we could keep listening to you,
Thank
but
you.
we have another panel. It was great to have that after lunch. I expect a wedding invite as well, and even better food. I'm looking forward to the food at the wedding as well. No, it was great. Another round of applause, please, to Lindsay and
Thank you.
we now have another session immediately to follow, so if Lindsay and Ibz could leave the stage. We have a break after this session, but don't leave yet. Right now, we've got, I had flagged, and you've probably seen our toolkit, and we want to make sure that those of you who are here today, whether in person or online, are able to get the most out of that toolkit. So to explain and introduce our toolkit further, I'm going to welcome Rain Sherlock, our evaluation manager, to the stage, who's going to go through that for you today.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you to Ibz and Lindsay. I think I've got the difficult task of bringing us back to the evidence base after a considerably more inspirational session post-lunch. So I am going to be talking us through the evidence toolkit, and before I do so, we've got another slidey. So I think it should be the same reference code or reference number if you would all like to go ahead and start filling this in. Luckily I'm here to fix this. Okay, so hopefully you'll all be much more aware over the next 15 minutes. It looks like there's definitely some work to do here. So we've obviously heard a lot this morning. We've heard some kind of fantastic speakers and also some really interesting Q&A. And one of the reflections I had kind of sitting waiting to come up just now is that I think we've talked a lot about how to generate better quality evidence, and particularly how to generate what we think of as type 2 or type 3 evidence according to the OFS standards of evidence. But I think it's equally important to think about the evidence that we already have and to use that evidence as a kind of platform or a foundation to build on and to inform our work moving forward. So it's some balance between understanding that we do have some evidence, we can use what we have to help direct and guide us, but there is still a lot of work to do and a long way to go in terms of generating new and better quality and more robust evidence. Which brings me to our evidence toolkit. So it looks like a lot of you aren't familiar with this. and let's remedy that. So we have kind of 3 key things that we hope our evidence toolkit can do for you. Number 1 is obviously to summarize existing evidence. So we think of these as kind of rapid evidence reviews. They're usually 1 website page. You can read them in kind of less than 10 minutes, and it gives you a good objective view on where we currently are according to any topic. So we have a bunch of kind of pre and post entry topics, things like the evidence on summer schools, the evidence on foundation years, etc. We would like you to, or we encourage you to use this evidence toolkit to inform your research. So if you're thinking about running an evaluation or setting up a research project, this is a good place to start. If you want to look at any topic that we've covered and you're thinking about kind of running evidence or running research in that area, then do use the existing evidence base as your platform. And of course, ultimately, to have greater impact. So use what we already know to help guide your decisions around the activities that you run, both kind of WP outreach and also student success programs and employability, both kind of post-entry. This is what the toolkit looks like. You can find it on our website. So the image on the left here is just each of the pages, each of the topics that we cover, and then a bunch of kind of key metrics or criteria for how we currently rate the evidence against that kind of topic or toolkit page. You can find the evidence toolkit on this QR code. I guess this is mostly for people watching us online. But in the little leaflet that you have, there is also a QR code. So you should be able to scan that and go and see the evidence toolkit on TASO's website. This has been referenced already today. I think Omar spoke about it briefly earlier, but we at TASO apply the OFS standards of evidence. So we have quite good type 1 evidence, what we think of as narrative evidence, which basically just helps us kind of understand why we think an activity might have an impact, and that's usually based on existing research or evaluation. We have some type 2, which we think of as kind of empirical inquiry or empirical research. So we're getting better at collecting data. We're getting better at generating comparison groups, not always true control groups, and looking at the relationship between activities and outcomes, but not necessarily with that causal link. And I guess unsurprisingly and quite frankly, I think we're really lacking this type 3, the causal evidence, so where we can clearly link activity X causing outcome Y, and that is largely what TASO are set up to do and what I'm kind of here to help with today. So for each topic that we cover, and I will talk you through exactly what we cover on the evidence toolkit in a moment, but for each of those topics, we kind of rank them, I guess, according to these 4 criteria. So we think about strength of evidence, which is basically kind of rated on how many type 3 studies there are already. So where we have no type 3 studies and kind of no strong evidence within the UK, we would say that the strength of evidence is either weak or kind of non-existent, non-applicable. For impact on aspirations and attitudes, we think of whether or not the evidence is that there's a kind of positive impact of the intervention on aspirations, a mixed impact, a negative impact, or again, actually not enough evidence to be conclusive at all. And the same applies to behavioural outcomes. So thinking beyond aspirations and looking at things like actual applications to higher education or entry to higher education, things that are behavioural and that we can measure objectively. And again, we would rate these from kind of positive, mixed, negative to no evidence at all. Cost is probably our most kind of basic or elementary rating. We just have high, medium, low cost, and this is according to what we can find in the literature and in the existing research. I wanted to dig into the strength of evidence a little bit more, because if you are looking through the toolkit and you see a page that is rated as, for instance, learning analytics having kind of mixed to no evidence at the moment, what we really mean by that is for a topic to be considered backed by strong evidence, we would need to see 5 or more kind of OFS type 3 trials within the UK. So that's 5 robust, well-conducted, randomized control trials to really know that there's strong evidence that something either does or doesn't work. And then that comes all the way down to weak evidence at the bottom here, where we basically don't have type 2 or type 3 evidence from the UK or the international context to be able to say whether or not something works. And for anyone who has scanned the QR code and looked at the toolkit, you'll see that at the moment the evidence really is quite mixed. There aren't a lot of interventions that we're using within HE that we can say conclusively have strong evidence, which I guess is why we're here. So these are the pages that we have currently covered. So we've got what we think of as just rapid evidence reviews for each of these. So financial support, both pre-entry to education and post-entry, so how we can support people financially once they're actually at university or within higher education. And then pre-entry, we have what we call IAG, Information, Advice and Guidance, which is super common and I'm sure most of you are familiar with. We then have mentoring, counselling and role models, and again we have that pre-entry, so as part of WP outreach, and also post-entry, so student success. And then MIOM, which we've spoken about already today, so multi-intervention programs, sometimes referred to as black box interventions, and summer schools is the final pre-entry topic that we have currently covered. We also then have a bunch of post-entry toolkit pages, so we've got, as well as financial support, foundation years, learning analytics, so the idea of using AI and more kind of analytical programs to help student support. Again, mentoring, counselling and role models, online teaching and learning, largely in the context of COVID and the kind of rapid shift online, and then programs of student support generally. I think we do have another Slido at the end of this to hear from you in terms of which topics you'd like us to cover next, and we are updating this toolkit regularly, so very much welcome your thoughts on that. So just briefly, for each page, we cover a number of kind of subsections, and we try to keep this really brief and easy to digest. I think we discussed in a few of the Q&As this morning this kind of idea of knowledge mobilization and how we can get better at sharing evidence. And this toolkit is obviously designed to help with that, and for that reason we've kept it quite brief and to the point. But we define the intervention, or at least how it's defined in the literature. We make it really clear which target group we're interested in. So is it focused specifically on mature learners or learners with a disability, or generally is it focused on WP students? We then summarize how effective it is based on the existing evidence, what features seem important, and most importantly, what we don't know, and the evaluation that we need to do in the future. And we also have a full reference list of where the evidence comes from, so you can read more about each of these topics by following that. So I guess coming full circle a bit, what can you use the toolkit for? So number one is to inform your outreach and support activities. So if you're delivering different activities to try and support and help disadvantaged and underrepresented students, it is great if that can be based on evidence. So use this as a springboard and a place to start. Inform your evaluation work specifically, and link to that as point 3 with a theory of change. So try to build theories of change and build your evaluation based on what we think we already know. Test those assumptions or the kind of mechanisms of change that you think are going to work, and see if there's any evidence to support that already. And then, of course, just to get curious, I'm sure you're all here because you value research and evidence in some way, and hopefully this will be a nice place for you to start and keep looking. So to come to some more Slido questions. So our first question, or our second question, I guess, is how useful is the toolkit for you in your role? Or if you haven't used it, how useful do you project it to be? Interesting. Great, so it looks like hopefully at least it will be of some use to many of you, 67% of you answering the poll. I'm going to move us on. I will actually pause here and give us a moment because it will be very useful for us as well to gather this data, but is there anything specific that you would find it really helpful to have a kind of rapid evidence review on? At the moment, our pages are focused on pre and post entry. Of course, we've since launched our new theme, so employment and employability, and also mental health and disability. So we'll continue to build the toolkit in line with those pages as well. Lots of raising attainment, unsurprisingly. Mental health makes sense. Great, and while you're filling that in, I think we have time, 10 minutes or so, for any questions specific to the toolkit, or I guess TASO's kind of evaluation agenda generally. Happy to take questions if anyone has any.
Thanks, Rain. Mike Kerrigan, Nottingham Trent University. I refer back to a question that was put to Omar just before lunch, which was asking if TASO could support universities in publishing their work. Now, it seems to me that there's a strong link here with the Evidence Toolkit and the universities being able to publish more work. So I'm just wondering if there's any mileage in having some sort of systematic calls for evidence. So not only could we publish our work through TASO, through a really trusted centralised body, but also it could also top up this toolkit, which is obviously an ongoing thing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mike. Great question, and actually a colleague and I, when Omar was asked that question, we're starting to scribble down ideas already, so it's definitely on the agenda. I guess the obvious thing is open calls for evidence regularly, and actually what I think I'd like to do is standardize a way that people can submit evidence at any point to the research inbox. So I think that's been a key takeaway for me today, is some kind of template, or at least some kind of format that we would accept evidence in. The assumption being then that we would review that as a sort of peer review process and decide how we can help disseminate and publish it. Of course, the toolkit is the obvious place. Because of how we standardize evidence and how we kind of categorize the strength of evidence, we would need to stick to that, and any kind of incoming evidence would obviously be put through the same process. We do actually have I think it's just an email address on the toolkit page at the moment that encourages someone to get in touch if you either know of a paper or have published a paper that could be added to the toolkit, and we often make small updates to those pages to include new and emerging evidence. So in terms of the toolkit, the process is absolutely there, but I agree, and it's kind of increasingly up the top of my priority list to develop a system that can allow people to submit evidence as and when they have it. And then I guess step 2 of that work is thinking through how we reflect it back to the sector, and kind of making it a bilateral process, I guess, rather than just a unilateral direction of travel. But yeah, good question. Watch this space, I think, is the answer. Got a question here in the middle.
Yeah. Hi, Rain. Colin McCaig from Sheffield Hallam University. Yeah, just on that, what you were just talking about, are you going to be able to make a distinction between university outreach teams putting up their own evidence or evidence they've commissioned from an independent evaluator?
So the question is, would we make it clear whether or not they had conducted the evaluation themselves or whether it had been independent?
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. So we do already do that in the evidence synthesis that we do. So we would kind of mark whether or not it was an independent evaluation, and I think we would agree to do so. I know we've discussed this a lot kind of pre-lunch this morning, and it probably goes without saying, but TASO do also advocate the independent evaluation approach. I think it's really important to retain and kind of encourage that objectivity. But that's not to say that there isn't interesting, what we might call kind of evidence of promise or emerging findings that come from more of this sort of grey literature or internal evaluation. And I guess what I wouldn't like is for the need for external evaluation to kind of squash or qualm the work that people are doing internally. So I encourage both to be submitted, but we would be very transparent and clear about whether or not it was independent when we publish it, and reflect that back to the sector, for sure. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. A question here at the front.
Oh, sorry.
Eunice Simmons, TASO Chair. A few comments on there about sense of belonging and as a possible subject for research. I do think that's really interesting, particularly the sessions that we've just heard. So how might we go about commissioning something on that?
Yeah, so I guess the two things to think about here are what are the type of activities that promote or create sense of belonging, and then a question that I'm particularly interested in, how do we measure that? And I think to date it's been something that is very difficult to measure, and it's also split between kind of pre-entry sense of belonging. So we often see that people are asked to project how much they think they will belong to somewhere that they haven't yet been or don't really know what that feels like or looks like, and I have always found it hard to wrap my head around that. And then there's the post-entry sense of belonging. So once you're there and you are experiencing HE, do you feel like you belong? from a measurement perspective, it's something that's coming out quite strongly in the work that we're doing with the Brilliant Club and researchers from Cambridge. So you heard from Lauren during the Measuring What Matters session earlier, and sense of belonging is going to be one of the constructs that we focus on as part of that survey validation work. So what we're hoping is that there will be a validated scale that allows us to measure self-reported sense of belonging in a uniform way across the sector. And we are also hoping to be able to disaggregate between that pre-entry sense of belonging and that post-entry sense of belonging. The first part of the question is, what do the activities that promote sense of belonging look like? And I feel less well placed to answer that. I think it's something we spend a lot of time thinking about, particularly with our kind of summer schools work and the work we do on multi-intervention outreach, because a lot of activities have sense of belonging in their theory of change, and they are hoping to promote and curate and create, I guess, the sense of belonging. But I think what I would think of as assumptions or kind of change mechanisms that underpin those assumptions are less clear, and I agree that it needs further research and a robust way to measure impact, which I hope we're getting to. Any further questions? One over here. Thanks, Sarah.
Hi, Sam Dyer, University of Exeter. Across the student life cycle, there is a huge amount of work to do, from access, success through to progression. And all of the people here today are evaluators or parts of our evaluation teams, but with finite resources and finite time. And I think we are all trying to grapple with where we direct and prioritise our efforts. So it's great that we have the toolkit and that we can kind of work together to try and get better at this, because it's actually quite complex work and it's hard to do. And trying to, I think, move the growth of the evaluation workforce in the last couple of years has been amazing. But a lot of us are trying to retrofit evaluation strategies onto existing programs of work that have been in place for many, many years. We're getting there, but it is complex, and I think I just wanted to make that plea that's why there aren't lots of type 3, because we're just getting our houses in order. So I just wondered if you had any observations on, do I try and get type 1 evidence across the piece, across the student life cycle, or do I direct my efforts very forensically on one type 2 or 3 piece of work?
Good question, and I can hear it in your voice, and also I think it's echoed across the sector that that we're trying, that we recognise all the effort that's been done, and there has been a lot of kind of change created over the last 5 years, but also appreciating and recognising that there's a long way to go. Unsurprisingly, working for TASO, I would say it's really important that we push for that kind of top-end type 2, type 3 evidence. And we are very much here to help and support with that. So we have a kind of number of existing kind of, I guess, evaluation guidance and resources on the website that are designed to be self-help, but if they're not, then get in touch. We're a relatively small research and evaluation team still, but we do make time for kind of 30-minute calls to help people get a foot in the door and understand how to navigate and use the tools that we have. We also use the model of working with research partners. Obviously, we can't work with everyone in the sector, but we often put out invitations to tender to work alongside us, and that most often that looks like us providing a research grant, so some funding to help with the resource allocation challenge, and bring in extra expertise. And of course, we also then work with independent evaluators. So the work that we do with you as research partners would be independently evaluated by a member of our panel. And the final point I wanted to pick up on, you said that you're often trying to kind of fit evaluation retroactively or retrospectively to activities that has already happened. Again, there are methodologies that allow us to look at data that we already have. And that might sometimes be a kind of quasi-experimental design. It's not going to be a randomized trial, obviously, because we can't randomize retrospectively. But there are QEDs, quasi-experimental options, or indeed, depending on the kind of size of your sample, some of the small N methodologies that we're going to be working with over the next 12 months can use existing data or data that you've already collected as well. So probably going to regret saying this, but get in touch. We have a kind of research at email box, and a huge part of our mission, and particularly my mission as the evaluation manager, is to support and capacity build and upskill the sector. So reach out. I'm getting a 2-minute warning sign, so I'm going to take 1 or 2 more questions.
Be the furthest away.
Thank you. Matthew Pavelski at Lancaster University. I just want to say this has been a fantastic day and I've learned so much, and yeah, it's been absolutely fabulous. And something that I've picked up over the course of the day is this, there seems to be a little bit of, there's sort of 2 different threads of demands on higher education institutions, I think. At the beginning with John Blake, he's talking very much about the overall impact of WP conducted by institutions on students, and talking very much at the macro level. And then I think a lot of this fantastic support very much applies to project level analyses, and conducting a randomized control trial can help demonstrate impact on a project level, and I'm sure everyone in this room and we're all trying our very best to implement those sorts of high quality evidence and evaluation practices. But I think what starts to really cause me not headaches, but it's interesting, I guess, is how do we then disaggregate the impact of widening participation on things like attainment gaps at the macro level? How do we strain widening participation out of a very complex picture? And I'm just wondering, sorry, it's quite a big question, but has there been any thought on it? Is this something that's potentially out there to be answered? Did you get my question there within that?
I'm not sure I completely understand the question, if I'm honest. Is the question around how we can isolate the impact of one activity on one outcome? Or
Yeah, I think we get a good idea of how to evidence impact of causality at the project level, but how do we then do it at the institutional level in terms of, how do we disaggregate the impact of widening participation initiatives against, say, changes in assessment procedures? Do we have any is there any thought on that? Is this an area that's been thought about, or has it yet to be considered?
it is a good question. Now I wish I had thought about it more to be able to answer it accurately. But I think we need, the way I see it at the moment is that it feels quite foggy. It feels quite hard to navigate, and I don't think we really have enough strong anchors or kind of stakes in the ground to help us navigate that fog. And I think the next step is understanding enough about what works and having some key stakes in the ground, some key activities that we know have a causal effect on the outcomes that we're interested in. And then with that, we can begin to, it's a kind of contribution attribution challenge. We can begin to isolate the impact of certain programs or certain WP initiatives and basically reduce the noise that I feel like you're alluding to in this wide world of WP and student success, and not really knowing within that, where to situate ourselves or where to anchor ourselves. But maybe it's a self-protection mechanism that I think we need to make the challenge more manageable, and at the moment we just need better evidence for a couple of those stakes in the ground, I think.
Thank you.
I think I better wrap up. I'm a couple of minutes over time. And I need to let you know that, so our next session, I think, combined with a coffee break maybe, is discussion points outside. So we've got a series of kind of poser tables or questions that are on different evaluation and WP challenges. So please feel free to grab a coffee and find a table that interests you. And I think we'll be meeting back here in about half an hour or so. Thank you very much.